Fair Play, a novel by Pete Fisher. Chapter 38, Continental Drift. John F. Kennedy Airport had the usual line of kiosks, each manned by an immigration officer. Martin's queue gradually got shorter. He stood at the window and handed over his passport. The brief, friendly smile on the officer's face evaporated in seconds. He looked at Martin's previous visas. They had a small but significant cipher. Martin didn't have a visa for this trip. Nobody thought he'd need one. He was en route to Bermuda. They were changing planes in New York. "I need you to go over there to that room now and wait, sir." He pointed to a door emblazoned with the Homeland Security emblem. Martin entered a large waiting room with rows of chairs. At the back of the room was a raised plinth on which there was a wide counter. Seated behind the counter were 3 uniformed armed officers. Each had a monitor screen in front of him and a telephone to his left. Martin sat down towards the back of the room and waited. "Dalgleish?" Martin walked up to the left of the counter. He stood waiting in front of the burly Customs and Border Protection officer. "Mr. Dalgleish, you've come here without an ineligibility waiver, so we're going to need to send you back to Germany." "But I'm in transit on the way to Bermuda." "In transit is not a thing anymore, sir. Not since 9/11. You have entered U.S. territory without the necessary visa. We need to send you back, sir." The longest day. It had almost been 24 hours since Martin had left home. He had to fly back on the same plane, which had a 12-hour turnaround. He was obliged to sit in that waiting room the whole time, essentially under arrest. For lunch and dinner, an officer brought him a Coke and a lukewarm hamburger. He had made 6 successful covert missions to the toilet for a couple of hits on a cigarette. At last it was time to go home. "Come with us, sir." 2 armed CBP officers escorted Martin down a series of secret corridors. They ran between the main passenger throughways. Neither of the officers uttered another word. They came out through an electronic door, as if by magic, right next to the boarding gate. Martin could feel the other passengers staring curiously. He asked for his passport back. The nervous little purser said he had to keep it until they got to Frankfurt. An unfriendly stewardess took Martin to the back of the plane and told him he must only sit in the assigned seat. The plane was half empty. Martin had a row of 3 seats all to himself. As soon as they reached cruising altitude, he stretched out and gratefully went to sleep. When they finally landed at Frankfurt, Martin politely asked again for his passport back. The purser said there were several administrative prerequisites he had to deal with first. Martin lost his temper and lunged at the little man. The purser recoiled in fright. Martin simply snatched the passport out of his hand and walked off, cursing loudly. Martin found a place to have a cigarette before he got the train home. He was so glad to be off that plane. But it was soul-destroying to think of having missed those 2 gigs in the Caribbean. Martin was standing in the VIP reception room, normally reserved for presidential visits. He was waiting for his passport to be stamped, along with all the others. He and the tour party had just landed at Paramaribo Airport. He had an ice-cold can of beer in one hand and a roll-up in the other. On the teak table at the side was a buffet of satay chicken, fried fish, spring rolls and other delights. Next to it, underneath a photo of the president, was an antique drinks cabinet. As well as cold beer, there was a wide array of spirits, a bucket of ice and fresh glasses lined up on the tablecloth. Welcome to Suriname. The promoter was one of the large Indian community in Paramaribo, just one of Suriname's many ethnicities. He gave them a brief tour of the city that morning. His wife cooked them all a fabulous multi-course Indian lunch at the family home. Afterwards, the band were taken out to the venue for a sound check in the afternoon on the outskirts of the city. They passed mosques, Sikh and Hindu temples and Catholic churches, all nestling comfortably next door to each other, interspersed with hoardings advertising Guinness and Red Stripe. The promoter's small Japanese minibus was embellished with colourful Indian decals. It stood parked outside the hotel, ready for the off. It was around 8 p.m. local time. Martin was squashed in with Frankie and the band, waiting to be driven to the gig. Richie rode shotgun up front. Guck Polizei! A police officer on a big motorbike had pulled up and stopped right in front of the minibus. He left his engine running. Shortly afterwards, a patrol car pulled in and stopped right behind. The promoter leant out of the sliding door at the side. He waved to signal the off. The convoy pulled away from the hotel. Frankie quipped that all it needed now was a siren. Right on cue, the motorcycle cop flipped on his siren and his flashing blue light. The patrol car behind followed suit. Frankie and the band laughed, cheered and clapped in delight. The motorbike slowed and stopped at every traffic light and blocked the side road traffic. The minibus went through several red lights. The cars ahead in both directions pulled over to let the convoy past. The back of the Dutch barn venue was fenced off, but dozens of fans were pressing themselves up against the chain link just to get a glimpse of Frankie. A few girls screamed his name. Richie had to drag him away before the fence caved in. A small basement underneath the stage served as a dressing room. It was windowless and barely large enough to accommodate the band. The promoter seemed to have brought most of his family along too. They felt like prisoners trapped in an underground cell. Thankfully, there was cold beer, soft drinks and water on hand. Someone had also thoughtfully provided a small bag of weed. Things weren't that bad. Richie finally announced it was showtime. The promoter seemed extremely nervous. Word had filtered through that the gig was sold out. Around 8,000 had bought tickets. Around half as many again without tickets had simply trampled down the entrance barriers. A tremendous roar went up as the band went on stage. The noise reflected directly back down from the metal roof. It was so loud it was distorting in Martin's ears. The PA had sounded great at sound check. Hearing himself above the crowd noise was going to be a problem. Martin stood close to Paul's keyboards. At least he could hear the offbeat chords. Most of Mark's drums disappeared into the morass. Luckily, he was heavy on the hi-hat. Martin and the band had never experienced anything like this. Every time they stopped playing, the crowd roared so loud it hurt. Even while the band were playing, they often managed to drown them out completely. Frankie mastered the situation by giving in to a stop-start routine. He simply stopped the band and let the crowd take over, a cappella. They could have played all night, but after about 90 minutes, Frankie and the band went down to the dressing room to choose an encore. Richie told everyone that as soon as the encores were over, they had to grab everything and go. The promoter couldn't guarantee their safety anymore. Martin went back up and put on his guitar, ready to play. Looking behind him, he saw a dozen armed police lined up along the back of the stage. Several had machine guns. It was clear they feared a full-scale riot. Frankie and the band did the encores and were hustled swiftly into the minibus. The chain-link fence was bulging inwards with jubilant fans. Richie virtually threw Frankie into the bus. He slammed the sliding door shut. They roared away down the access road in a cloud of dust, past groups of fans who had gathered to catch a glimpse of Frankie. Martin did his best to take it all in. Martin was in the nightliner, sitting at the very front next to the driver, fiddling with his phone. He was on the way from Switzerland to Hungary. He had butterflies, not because of the gig. He had a date. It had been 4 years now since he'd met Emma in Slovenia, down by the river. At last they had the chance to actually meet up again in Budapest. She was there for the big annual music festival. He wrote her a text to say he'd be at the hotel in an hour. Martin called a taxi from reception. The driver whisked him into town to the square Emma had chosen as a rendezvous. He paid, then stepped out into the warm evening air. He'd waited so long for this. He spotted 2 young women approaching. One had henna red hair that shone in the evening sun. He recognized her as Emma. The other girl was her best buddy, Ursa. Emma ran into his arms, hugging him close. He greeted her and kissed her on both cheeks. They both grinned like Cheshire cats. "Good to see you, Emma. Hi, Ursa." Emma got to the point. "You hungry, Martin?" "I'm starving. I found a good place. Let's eat." Martin walked through the evening crowds. With a beautiful lady on each arm, he felt like a king. The restaurant was an old-fashioned eatery close to the chain bridge over the Danube. The lights of the bridge glimmered in the dusk beneath the illuminated castle walls up on the hill. It was traditional hearty fare, soup served in a scooped-out spherical loaf, stew and dumplings and goulash with noodles. They polished off several carafes of red wine. Then the waiter kept bringing them complimentary shots of palinka, the local fruit brandy. It took a joint effort to get him to stop and bring the bill. The 3 of them emerged into the evening giggling. It was still warm, but dark now. Emma suggested they walk across the chain bridge and have a look at the castle. It had started to rain. None of them cared. They walked along between the lights of the bridge and climbed up the long, wet stone steps to the castle. They found a colonnade to shelter from the rain. All 3 sat leaning up against the back wall, looking over the castle grounds. Emma had a small rucksack with her. She pulled out a bottle of red wine and one of mineral water, along with a bag of homegrown weed. Martin managed to roll a spliff despite the damp conditions. They passed it around along with the bottle of wine. Martin and Emma talked non-stop. They were trying in vain to catch up on several years. Ursa listened thoughtfully. Martin felt so high, not just from the weed and wine. Emma put her head on his shoulder and sighed. They sat for another hour or so, but by then they were all tired. Down by the river, Martin gave the ladies both fond farewell hugs before he got into the taxi. What a night! In the hotel dining room the next morning, Martin felt like he had hardly slept. His head was throbbing from all that beer, wine and palinka. He actually felt a bit queasy. It didn't help that a chef was manning a rather smoky griddle in the corner. Martin forced down a couple of a la carte fried eggs, sunny side up. He downed as much coffee as he could. He began to feel human again. Seeing Emma again at the festival was really nice, but short-lived. They grabbed a few precious hours together that afternoon before the show. Martin couldn't stop thinking about having to say goodbye. He could see her standing a little way back in the crowd while he played. She waved. They met up again for a beer afterwards. Then the bus had to leave. The band looked on as Martin hugged and kissed Emma next to the bus. God, how he hated saying goodbye. He prayed that somehow he'd see her again. She was special. Martin remembered way back when soundcheck had actually been fun. It had often turned into a bit of a jam session on those early tours. Nowadays it was a tediously routined procedure, the price of perfectionism. He was standing on stage, last in line, patiently waiting his turn. After Martin had checked his guitar sound, Mark clicked his sticks 4 times and the band locked into a rhythm. It sounded pretty good on stage. Pip flipped in the main speakers and the sound bounced wildly around the empty hall. It was reflecting off the sides and the back wall. Martin put his monitor earpieces in. It sounded fine. Just then, Martin's guests arrived. His old buddy Mike, Terry, who'd fronted Quicksand, and his wife Sandra walked into the hall. They stood a little way from the stage and gave Martin a quick wave. Martin waved back. After soundcheck, they all sat down with Martin at one of the large tables in the backstage dining room. They were impressed by the setup. We saw the trucks and buses outside. Yeah, I know, ridiculous, isn't it? Martin found the whole thing a bit overblown. Bit bigger than my old van. Too right, Terry. I try not to think about what it all costs. They were in Amsterdam. It was the end of the biggest tour Frankie and the band had undertaken. Compared to the first tours they'd done, the logistics on this one were ludicrous. It now required 2 double-decker buses to cart over 30 people around and 2 40-ton articulated trucks to carry the gear. Martin really was totally exhausted now after 6 weeks on tour. The gigs had been great, but he'd hardly seen anything of the places they'd played in, just the venues and occasional hotels. He was really looking forward to getting on the bus that night and going home. Martin was glad it was a good night for the band. He wanted his friends to see them at their best. The Dutch audience really made them feel appreciated, jumping high and singing loud. With a party atmosphere on stage too, they did several encores. Then the tour was over, the last gig until the next year. Martin had a whole mixture of feelings. Most of that fun and laughter in the beginning had been crushed by the sheer pressure of constantly having to be so thoroughly professional. Seeing those trucks and buses outside the venues, watching tons of equipment being loaded in and out every day, it made him wonder. Hadn't he actually had more fun playing sweaty little clubs in front of 500 people